as I alluded to in my intro, you have quite a, well, storied career within many areas of financial services. And would love to get your views specifically on payments, how it has evolved over the years as you've taken different leadership roles, and how have these payment innovations shaped your career?
Yeah, that's a great question. My team jokes with me that I've built three different generations of money, and I've been fortunate to kind of see these different waves across financial services and payments in particular. Started out my career in traditional finance, was at Merrill Lynch Wealth Management for a while, at Credit Suisse. So got a taste of how traditional finance legacy institutions are set up and how they've scaled over time. And then I got antsy from there and really moved my career towards fintech, and was fortunate to get a role with Venmo, and this was post PayPal acquisition. I think that's where I had my first sort of realization that one, financial services, especially for consumers, was moving to this construct of financial experiences, where this is, if you rewind back in the day, this is when Uber was starting to break out and everyone was making these comparisons. Well, my Uber app works this way, but my Chase banking app still functions this way, or even most banks don't even have an app at that time. And when Venmo came along, it really was this breakthrough from an experience perspective, where it made something as simple as domestic peer-to-peer payments instant, free for the consumer. And it added this layer of delight on top, where you could add like a payment note, you could add emojis. It had a whole kind of social angle to it. So that's what allowed for that breakthrough to happen from a product market fit perspective. And frankly, it was like the only consumer payments breakout over the last 10 years in the US when it happened. So that was very eye-opening for me, for where the consumer expectations and the bar had moved to, and what eventually all financial services providers would have to move towards. At the same time, after spending a few years at Venmo, my other kind of key insight and realization was that even though the experience layer had moved up, ultimately, though, it was all pretty much a wrapper around like legacy rails and legacy settlement systems, because all of the fintech experiences, especially in the US, they sit atop of some bank where all the custody happens, where all the settlement happens. And those pipes are basically those same COBOL run machines and EDL pipelines and all that good stuff. So I think that's where, when I came across the Bitcoin white paper and I really started like looking into this technology, it became clear and clear to me that while the front end was evolving, this would be a solution to the back end of financial plumbing, and providing this tech-enabled, internet-native ledger that didn't really need intermediaries, that could be instant and global from day one. That was, I think, a huge R&D breakthrough, a computer science breakthrough, and really a gift to the world from Satoshi Nakamoto of, look, this is something that we can all adopt and as open source, and we can go ahead with it. That said, it took a long time for that R&D to become a technology, to become a product, to really start getting into the mainstream. And that's where we are today.
I really love how you said how fintech moves things towards from a point of view of customer centricity. And then also the interesting thing that you said there is that when we first started, you have your communication layer that moves very far, but your settlement layer probably needs to move across multiple correspondent banks anytime you need to do a transaction. And that, in the end of the day, that also creates some customer frustration at points in time. But I think we are moving very fast now, right? And the thing with many of such evolutions is it does take time for the right regulatory framework to be in place, the right institutional adoption to come into place, the right trust, right? But when it takes off, it can be pretty fast, right? And as is what we are seeing today, right? And then maybe we segue into something that, a trend that we've been seeing quite a lot now, in a sense where I think Bitcoin started out as like a digital gold thesis. And now, and people used to correlate a lot of the Web3 side with, speculative digital gold, store of value. But I think a big macro shift that's been happening around recently is stablecoin utility, as well as this whole movement starting in the US, I would say, maybe, towards tokenization. So we'd love to get your thoughts. How do you see recent developments on partnerships between Wall Street institutions and Coinbase? How is that impacting stablecoin momentum and adoption, at least from what you see here in Singapore and the broader Southeast Asia market?
Yeah, it's been a very transformative cycle for crypto, I would say, the whole industry. So I think in the last 4 years or so, whilst there was a lot that was going on in terms of just cleansing out and purging the industry, actually behind the scenes, there was a ton of work that was being done both on the technology scaling side. So today, blockchains are much more performant than they were a few years ago. So if you recall, like back in up till 2021, people would be concerned on, hey, Ethereum is the main kind of layer one for smart contracts, and it taps out at 13 transactions per second. And if there's this NFT mint, and gas fees are going to spike to $80. No one talks about that anymore, right? At Base, which is our layer 2, or Solana, which is a high performance layer 1, we've increased throughput to call it like roughly about like 50% of like where Visa scale is today. So transactions that are under 1 second, under 1 cent are very commonplace, and that's still continuing to improve. So I think that's one big unlock that the industry has achieved over the last few years. The second kind of big change that's happened is just the regulatory posture. In the US was sort of really the main, I would say, inhibitor in terms of regulatory choke point. There was a whole regime of regulation by enforcement. That's a bad dream at this point. It's all withered away. The new sort of posture is very much, hey, let's make sure there's clear rules of the road. Let's make sure that not only are we just providing regulatory baselines, but how is the US going to be a leader in both crypto and AI? And they're taking a lot of pro-business and pro-innovation initiatives to achieve those outcomes. So I think with that backdrop, what I would say the big kind of headline here is that the industry has matured. And that's evidenced by all of these institutions that have moved towards digital assets and stablecoins. Our partnership with BlackRock, when they announced their ETFs, for example, like that was a big like coming out moment for all of crypto. Those ETFs were like Bitcoin's like IPO in some ways because it provided this bridge from what was traditionally maybe like a crypto native pool of capital bridged over to traditional pools of capital. So I think we've seen a lot of adoption and uptake. If you just look at the ETF products, those are for Bitcoin, like those are the most successful ETFs that have been launched in BlackRock's history. Beyond that, like we're seeing banks start to jump in head first. So the Genius Act was a huge catalyst, especially for stablecoins in the US. It's funny now, like every bank has some sort of a stablecoin program. And what's nice about it is that it's not just announcements and pilots, they're actually moving it into production because they understand the size of the prize is now big enough that it can actually move the needle for them as well.
Actually, I like what you particularly said in your first cut on how the technology has stabilized and moved such that you have massively increased the speed and reliability of such transactions. Right? Because if I recall during COVID, when we were all sitting at homes, nothing to do, I was going deep into the initial phase of the DeFi world. And I remember the times when the gas fees really do spike and you literally have to wait in front of the computer and wait and maybe come back like maybe a couple of hours later, hopefully come back at a better time so that we don't pay exorbitant gas fees. And I think the state where we are at right now is probably testament to what Coinbase is building as well with what you have with Base. And then, of course, building the institutional layer kind of trust. The more people read about what's happening with BlackRock and those names you mentioned, the more it becomes mainstream and less of a niche kind of thing, which is so important.
That's exactly right. I think the old mental model that people had was that the crypto economy was here and traditional finance was here. The reality today is that those two have really intersected and collided with accelerating pace. And so now it's really these big institutions that are ones that are really propagating for digital assets. So the conversation and the tenor has really changed.
Yeah, and it's a bit like the internet era, right? You used to have the traditional era and internet era, but today is one digital world that, of course, is very similar as we move online to offline. But I think it's a similar paradigm, but in fintech.
One way to think about it is that, these are these big technology waves that come and they reshape these industries, and everyone has a choice whether they're going to adopt or not adopt, whether they're going to win or lose. So to be fair, for financial services, regulations is a huge baseline. You have to have regulatory confidence that, look, if I adopt this, if I invest in this area, I'm not going to risk the rest of my core franchise. So I think that's why Genius is such a landmark bill. And we're hopeful that Clarity Act in the US will pass as well. Yeah. We can talk about this part of the world, which actually has had regulatory clarity for a long time.
There's a good segue, right? Since we're talking about regulatory frameworks, regulatory architecture, and I think usually the retail follows institutional and what is going mainstream, and that also follows regulatory positioning, regulatory posture. And I think what's interesting then now is how Singapore has positioned itself, and we've been early movers in the regulatory frameworks as well. Perhaps to dive a bit deeper into this is what role did Singapore play in particular for Coinbase Asia to kind of set up your presence here and also push a lot of the things that you're doing for the region through Singapore in the context of tokenized assets or other contexts as well?
So Singapore has been very smart in terms of thinking long term, in terms of having this fantastic infrastructure, both physical but also legal infrastructure that is very pro-business, and the government just performs at a very high level in terms of thinking ahead, mapping policy objectives, and then also implementing and executing against those objectives. This is an open economy and it's a big financial hub. I would say that maybe in the late 90s up to like early 2000s, there was a huge sort of movement around like Singapore being a fintech hub. And then within that, when the Digital Payment Services Act was announced in 2019, there was a specific substrate in there about digital payment tokens. And what that effectively did was recognize crypto in a kind of legally classified way. And again, provide clear of the rules of the road for industry players for, hey, if I want to provide crypto related services in the market, this is what I need to follow. This is the kind of license I have to apply for. And these are going to be my supervisory obligations going forward. So if you rewind back the clock a few years, the US had a very hostile approach towards crypto and they were trying to drive it offshore, frankly. So against that backdrop, Coinbase is a global company and it just made a lot of sense for Coinbase to also think about, okay, if we were to set up like different hubs around the world, what would some of those be? We already had an office in the UK. We actually are the leading player in the UK. And Singapore just made a lot of sense to be the Asia hub. We knew we were going to enter Asia at some point. So that felt like the right timing. And once the licensing regime was announced, I think it further cemented our belief that this was going to be a good hub to operate out of.
Actually, which brings to a point, right, where I always think that people say that maybe rules restrict innovation. But actually, in certain cases, when you have clearer frameworks, clearer boundaries, actually encourages innovation because people know where are the areas that we can push out. Perhaps if you have a sort of sandbox regime in which to test out new innovations. And that's what really drives a lot of the new push. And I think that, for example, the MES recently has this Bloom initiative as well, which I think is encouraging a lot of cross-sector, cross-private sector collaborations.
We're fortunate that since I started the office here about 5 years ago now, we've grown tremendously. So we have an engineering hub in Singapore as well in partnership with EDB. We got our DPT license about 2.5 years ago. And once you're more integrated into the fabric of the local community, the local industry, that also opens up additional optionality. Like we want to be good corporate citizens and give back to grow the ecosystem. That's something that I think a lot about. Like how do we grow the digital assets ecosystem in Singapore? And so when Project Bloom came up as an opportunity, we were very excited about it. The MAS FinTech Infrastructure Office has done similar initiatives in the past. There was Project Guardian and Project Orchid. So I think Bloom is meant to be an evolution of Orchid, thinking about programmable money, but then going beyond. And so one of the areas that we've been investing into is this area of agentic payments. So we are contributing towards Project Bloom on the AI agentic commerce front. And it's very kind of frontier technology, but we think that this is a really meaty topic that will become important in a few years that we're excited to participate under the MAS umbrella.